First number I ever read into the transmitter was 14. That was Supervisor Cale Orvan's idea, not mine. He did it before I understood what he was doing. Just picked up the marker, tore the back panel off an empty ration sleeve, wrote it in block figures 2 centimeters tall. 14. He held it up so I could see it across the room. Then he set it on the console in front of me and tapped it twice with one finger before walking back to the forward and facing window slots, where he'd been watching the tree line. I didn't ask him what it meant. The post was already 3 hours into lockdown, and I had 17 active relay channels trying to reach the Halveth 3 garrison at the same time, and the garrison wasn't answering, and the Veth Karath were visible on thermal across the ridge line in numbers I didn't have a training category for. I had other things to occupy my attention. But the ration sleeve was sitting there on the console in front of me when the hour rolled over on the internal clock. 01 Noro, post local, and I put it in my hand and I read it into the open channel the same way I read all of our standard hourly status. Pings, calm voice, even cadence. The way Orvan had trained me to speak into a transmitter the first week I'd arrived at Vareth 9, as if someone important was listening and you didn't want them to hear fear in the signal. Vareth 9 listening post, hour 1. Status, 14 alive. The transmission. The same way I logged all the others, noted the channel frequency and the timestamp, and went back to the relay attempts. Orvan didn't say anything. He was still watching the tree line. I want to be careful about what I say I understood then, because the honest answer is that I didn't understand much. I knew the Veth Karath had established a containment envelope around the ridge sometime in the 2 hours before the lockdown alarm tripped. That was, in the thermal data and in the electromagnetic interference patterns, that had been eating our long-range relay capacity since 230. I knew that the garrisons had not responded to any of our 40-plus contact attempts, which meant either the garrison was compromised, the relay chain was broken somewhere in the middle distance, or both. I knew the post was 14 people, 8 signals intelligence contractors including myself, 4 military liaison staff, and 2 attached xenolinguistics researchers who had been at Vareth 9 for 3 weeks running a passive monitoring study on Veth Karath, its electromagnetic output, and who now occupied the back corner of the main transmitter room, looking at each other in a way that suggested their study had taken a professional turn they hadn't anticipated. What I didn't understand at hour 1 was why Orvan had written the number. Took me until approximately hour 6 to work it out. And by then the understanding arrived as something I didn't have to explain to myself. It was simply a fact that settled into place the way facts do when the pressure is high enough to press out every non-essential thought and leave only the things that are actually true. The Veth Karath were listening, not in a speculative sense. The xenolinguistics researchers, their names were Sarah Pell and Dov Ansher, had been documenting for 3 weeks how the collective processed signals traffic in the ridge corridor. The collective didn't communicate in language the way we understand language. It pulsed electromagnetic clusters that encoded state changes. Something that had been alive was now dead. Something that had been absent was now present. A resource that had been inaccessible was now recoverable. It cataloged transitions. The living, as a category, were interesting to it, only at the moment they became dead. That was when they entered the collective's filing architecture. Until that transition, they were simply an uncategorized variable in the collective's ongoing environmental assessment. Pell had put it differently in one of her field notes, which I read during a gap in hour 4 when the relay attempts had stalled, and I had nothing useful to do with my hands for 11 minutes. She'd written, "The Veth Karath do not count the living. They count the transitions. The living are pre-transition. The dead are post-transition. A count of the living is, in the collective's architecture, an undefined operation, like asking a library to shelve a book that hasn't been written yet." Orvan had read those notes. Of course he had. He read everything that came through Vareth 9. That was his job. And at some point in the 2 hours before the lockdown alarm, or in the 3 hours of lockdown before he picked up the marker and tore the ration sleeve, he had arrived at a conclusion that I was only catching up to now. If the collective cannot file a count of the living, then a count of the living is noise to it. And if the count is noise, it cannot respond to the count. And if it cannot respond to the count, then the count is safe to transmit. And if the count is safe to transmit, it is the one piece of information we can put into open air, into the frequencies the collective is monitoring, into every relay channel we have, through the interference and through the containment envelope. And the collective won't suppress it, because the collective won't recognize it as information worth suppressing. It'll reach whoever is out there, if anyone is out there. 14. Then the clock rolled over. By hour 6, when that understanding finished settling, there were 12 of us. Tore a new scrap from the same ration sleeve. There was enough of it left, barely, and wrote 12 in the same block figures Orvin had used. The marker was mine now. He'd set it beside the sleeve when he left the transmitter room to take a position at the east-facing window array with 2 of the military liaison staff. And he hadn't come back for the marker, and I'd picked it up without thinking about it, and carried it to the console, with me the way you carry something that belongs in your hand. I crossed out the 14 on the back panel, wrote 12 above it, hour 6 status transmission, 12 alive. Pell was watching me from the corner. She'd pulled her knees up in the chair, a small woman, dark hair loose, field jacket too large for her, the collar turned up on one side and flat on the other. She didn't say anything. I logged the transmission and went back to the relays. The thing about the relay attempts in those early hours, the first 10, 12 hours, was that they were not hopeless. They were methodical. Orvin had given me a rotation before he'd taken up his position, cycle the relay frequencies on a 20-minute interval, prioritize the 3 most likely surviving chain nodes based on the pre-lockdown traffic map, log every attempt and every non-response with full timestamp so that the gap pattern itself became data. If someone was out there and receiving fragments, the gap pattern would tell them how long we'd been transmitting, how regularly, and therefore when to expect the next attempt. The regularity was important to him. I understood that now in the same way I understood the number on the ration sleeve, not as a strategy explained to me, but as a logic that had become self-evident under pressure. We were not hiding, we were announcing. That was the inversion. Every training exercise I'd been through, every lockdown protocol in the post's manual, every piece of doctrine that covered a situation where a forward-listening post was cut off and under pressure from a hostile force, all of it oriented around reducing your signal footprint, pulling in your transmissions, going quiet and small and hard to find. Don't advertise your position. Don't tell the enemy what you have or what you don't have. The doctrine made sense for conventional adversaries. The Veth Karath were not a conventional adversary. The collective's electromagnetic monitoring architecture was passive and total. It didn't need us to transmit to know where we were. It had known where Vareth 9 was since before we'd built it. The thermal signatures of 14 human bodies in a prefab hardpoint on a conifer ridge, not something we could hide by going quiet on the transmitter. It wasn't tracking us through our signals. It was simply present, the way weather is present. A distributed pressure that had no single source and no single point to push back against. Going quiet would not hide us. Going loud would not hurt us. The collective wasn't finding us through our transmissions. But going loud, at the right frequencies, in the right pattern, might reach someone in the Halveth 3 relay chain who was alive and listening, and trying to find us the same way we were trying, find them. And the hourly status ping with the living count embedded in it, a data structure the collective would hear and set aside as undefined, the same way you set aside a sentence in a language you don't speak, would pass through the containment envelope and keep passing. 14. Then 12. I was doing the math on the ration sleeve margins automatically, without deciding how much sleeve left, how many more numbers. The sleeve ran out at hour 9. I was reaching for the next one in the field ration stack when Ancher, the second xenolinguistics researcher, broader than Pell, with a close-cropped beard and the specific stillness of a man who has decided that staying calm is a skill he is going to apply, everything he has, held out his own ration sleeve, already torn open on the back panel, a blank white surface about the size of a playing card. Took it, I wrote the number on it. 11. He went back to his corner. I transmitted. Vareth 9 listening post, hour 9. Status, 11 alive. 11 held for a long time. Long enough that I started to think of it as stable, which is a mistake you make when you're deep enough into lockdown that your baseline for normal has shifted, and you no longer remember what stable actually felt like before the alarm tripped. Shh was quiet in the ways that had stopped registering as quiet and started registering as routine, which is a different thing. Routine means the pressure is still there, but it isn't changing. Quiet means the pressure is absent. What we had was routine. The post's slatted exterior walls admitted light from the south-facing side in long pale columns through the morning hours. Halveth 3 ran a 26-hour day, and the local sunrise came late, and the conifer canopy broke it further, so the light that it's found its way into the main transmitter room had traveled through 3 layers of filtering before it reached the console. By mid-morning it was broad and white and carried no heat. It sat on the equipment panels like snow, still and flat, and moved across the room as the hours passed. We were all watching it at some point or another. There were 11 of us, and the transmitter room was not designed to hold 11 people at rest for an extended period. It was a signals workspace, 4 at a shift, cramped even then, all angled panels and cable runs, and the 2 large primary transmitter arrays that dominated the back wall. People had claimed floor space and corners, and the narrow corridor beside the secondary relay rack that wasn't quite a corridor. That was the space left over when the relay rack had been pushed slightly away from the wall to allow access to the cooling port. 3 people could sit in that space with their knees touching the opposite wall. Over those hours of 11, I knew which 3 people were currently occupying it without looking. The same way you learn the geography of any room you're going to live in for a while. Orvin checked in at each hour mark in person, came back to the transmitter room from whatever position he was holding, looked at the count, at me, and went back. He never changed the count. Whatever the hour gave, and he accepted it and went back to his position. I don't know what he thought about the count. He didn't say, and I didn't ask, and there was a principle operating in the room by that point, communal and unspoken and absolutely respected, that the number on the ration sleeve front of me was a fact, not a conversation. You could look at it. You couldn't argue with it, or speculate about it, or offer opinions on what it's become. It was what it was. I was grateful for that principle. I hadn't articulated it. No one had. It was simply the agreement the room had arrived at. The way the room had arrived at the agreement that the transmitter stayed active. And the relay attempts stayed regular, and the hourly status ping went out without fail. We were the only ones doing the things we were doing. No one was going to do them for us. Hour 14, the light had shifted to afternoon, and Pell came to sit beside me at the console. She didn't ask to help with the transmitter, and I didn't offer. The transmitter was mine, in the same way that the marker was mine and the ration sleeves were mine. We'd all found the things that were ours in that room, the specific tasks or positions, or tools that anchored us, and the anchors were not interchangeable. But she sat beside me and she started talking, quietly and without hurry, in the way that people talk. When they're not performing calm but are actually calm, is a rare thing in a locked-down hardpoint in a conifer ridge with an electromagnetic collective pressing on the perimeter. She talked about her work. Not the current work. The Veth Karath study, the data she'd been gathering for 3 weeks, field notes I'd read during hour 4. Earlier work. The dissertation research 3 years prior, on a different collective intelligence entirely, a sessile crystalline distributed network, on a world called Merath 7 that had been cataloging electromagnetic phenomena in its region for what the geological record suggested was roughly 40,000 years. She'd spent 8 months on site with a sampling team, trying to understand how the network organized its records. The thing she'd found, she said, was that every collective intelligence she'd encountered organized its records around transitions, state changes. The moment a thing became something different from what it had been, it was the only thing they needed to know. Before and after, the before was implicit. You didn't need to record what a thing was before it changed. The change itself implied it. The only record that mattered was the after. Humans didn't do that, she said. Humans recorded the before, the living, not the dead, the present, not the transition. The count of what was still here, She said it without any particular significance in her voice, the same flat evenness she'd been maintaining since hour 1. I wrote the next number on the next ration sleeve. Still 11, and I transmitted it. At the hour mark, and the light moved another increment across the equipment panels. And she was quiet again. I thought about what she'd said for a long time after. I'm still thinking about it. The relay break happened at hour 19. I'd cycled through the priority nodes 38 times by then, and received nothing from any of them. Not a full acknowledgement signal, not a partial packet, not even the fragmented carrier tone that would indicate a receiver was present and active somewhere in the chain. The silence had its own texture by hour 19. I knew the silence in the way you know the feel of a surface you've been running your hand across. Hours. The specific resistance of it, the places where it didn't quite break, the exact quality of the not response that arrived every 20 minutes. So when the break came, I recognized it before I'd consciously processed what I was hearing. It was a carrier tone, fragmented, badly degraded, frequency cycling in a way that suggested the transmitter on the other end was operating at reduced capacity or through significant interference. But it was there. It had the specific shape of a human-made transmission, not a Veth-Karath electromagnetic pulse cluster. Those were structured differently, and I'd been listening to the ambient collective signal bleeding through the monitoring channels for long enough that I could distinguish the two without having to check the spectral analyzer. Someone in the relay chain was alive and transmitting. I locked the channel and held position and did not transmit back for 30 seconds while I let the fragmented carrier tone build a profile. Northeast, consistent with the second node in the priority rotation, the one at Halva 3 forward relay station 8, power output suggesting the relay station was running on backup generation. Interference pattern consistent with significant electromagnetic suppression in the intermediate corridor. The collective's containment extended. Further than Verith 9 alone, it was blanketing the whole ridge system. I made note of the time, 1954 post-local, 19 hours and 54 minutes since the lockdown alarm. The carrier tone had been present for approximately 40 seconds before I'd caught it, which meant my cycling interval had very nearly missed it. The window was narrow. I adjusted the cycle timing by 3 minutes, splitting the difference between the current interval and a tighter one, betting that the window would recur at approximately the same width. It was not a complicated adjustment. But I noted it because it's the kind of thing that matters and doesn't appear in the official transmission logs to record what was sent and received, but not the micro-calibrations that kept the relay cycling through the interference. The calibrations were in my head. They would have been lost if the count had gone differently. I transmitted on the same frequency. Verith 9 listening post. We are here. We are transmitting hourly status. 11 alive as of hour 19. The carrier tone fragmented further. A word came through clearly in the gap. Acknowledged. Then how long? 19 hours I transmitted. 11 alive. We are stable. What is your status? The response took 4 minutes, which told me the relay station was having its own problems with transmission windows. Working around the interference the same way I was. Working around it, finding the gap frequencies, and pushing through when the suppression eased. When it came through, it was partial, and I had to reconstruct 2 of the words from context. Station 8, 12 survivors. Extraction protocol initiated. Window unknown. Hold position. I logged the transmission time and the content and the spectral profile. It up the same way I wrote up every relay attempt regardless of outcome, and then I sat with my hands on the console for a moment and did not move. Then I turned around and told the room. 11 faces. They heard it. No one shouted. There was a sound, collective and involuntary, not quite a breath and not quite a word. The sound of 11 people releasing a pressure they'd been holding since the alarm had tripped. Not fully, not permanently, but enough to know it was possible to release it, which meant it was possible to not be holding it, which meant there was a state beyond this one. Orvin was looking at me from the corridor space beside the relay rack. He had one shoulder against the wall, and his arms crossed over his chest, and he was looking at me the way he looked at everything in the post, with the specific attention that doesn't read as examination, but is examination. The attention that registers everything and files it without expression. He held my eye for a moment. Then he nodded once, turned, and went back to his position at the east-facing window array. I wrote 11 on the next ration sleeve. Transmitted at the hour mark. Breath 9 listening post, hour 20. Status, 11 alive. The hours between 20 and 31 were the hours that tested the most. Shh. Not because they were the worst in terms of the pressure on the perimeter. The collective was patient in a way that was difficult to explain to someone who hadn't spent time in its presence, but that Pell had described early in her field notes as not aggressive but appative. It wasn't trying to breach the post. It was waiting for the post to become accessible. The difference was important. Aggressive meant the threat was time compressed. It was going to escalate, reach a peak, either succeed or fail, and then withdraw. Appetitive meant the threat had no time horizon. It was simply positioned and oriented, and would remain so. The collective had no concept of exhausting its patience. Because patience as a category requires the existence of a desired outcome that isn't yet achieved, and a sense of the time cost that waiting imposes. The collective didn't experience waiting as a cost. It experienced nothing as a cost. It was simply present. That was what tested the most in those middle hours. Not the fear of an assault. The assault wasn't coming. Or wasn't coming in the form I'd trained for, the discrete perimeter breach with a beginning and a middle and an end. The testing was the understanding that the collective was not going to get tired or distracted or called away. Whatever was outside the walls of Verith 9 had been outside those walls for 19 hours and was going to be outside those walls for 19 more, if that was what was required, and 19 more after that, because it did not experience the passage of time the way we did. We did. That was the asymmetry. We experienced the passage of time exactly as it passed every hour of it, and the hours in the middle of the lockdown had a particular weight to them that the early hours didn't. Because in the early hours the urgency had been running, and in the middle hours the urgency was sitting still, and that was harder. The marker helped. I mean that literally, physically. The act of writing the number, picking up the marker, tearing the next ration sleeve, writing the block figures, holding it up so the room could see it, reading it aloud into the transmitter, was a physical act in a sequence of physical acts, and the sequence had a duration. And the duration interrupted the weight of the hours. Every 60 minutes I had something to do with my hands that was not waiting. The doing of it was approximately 3 minutes of the 60. Those 3 minutes were not waiting. They were the opposite of waiting. They were the announcement. The room learned to orient to the hour marks. I didn't see this happen. It accumulated gradually. The way the light on the equipment panels moved across the room, and I only recognized it in retrospect. But by hour 24, the whole room had synced its interior clock to the transmitter cycle, 8 closer to the hour mark than not. People moved between positions closer to the hour mark than not, going from the relay rack corridor to the south-facing window and back, finding the route that let them pass behind me as I was writing the number, and hear the transmission as it went out. They weren't watching me. They were calibrating. The hour mark was rhythm, and the rhythm was something to move inside, something that made the time between marks bearable because there was a next mark coming. Ansher told me this after, weeks after, in a debrief room in the Garrison Hospital, while I was waiting for the second round of scan clearances that the Garrison medical staff required, before they'd release anyone who'd spent extended time in a Veth Kareth adjacent environment. He told me that by hour 26, he'd started counting the minutes to the next transmission on his own internal clock, not the minutes to the extraction, which were unknown and therefore uncountable, but the minutes to the next hour mark, always knowable and always finite. 40 minutes, he'd tell himself. 30-20, and when it was 3 minutes, he'd find a reason to be in the transmitter room. The number dropped twice in those middle hours. Hour 22. Alive. I wrote it. I read it. I logged it. The room took it the same way the room had taken every number that wasn't 11, silently, completely, without argument. 9 alive was the fact. We noted it and went on. Orvin came to look at it and went back to his position. The light moved. Hour 29, 8 alive. I want to note, because it matters and because I won't discuss it beyond this, both of the changes in that period were incursions at the perimeter that were repelled, that the people who changed the count were not lost to the collect from inside the post, but at the post's edges, which is a different kind of loss and is simultaneously better and worse. Better because it meant the post's interior was holding. Worse because it meant people were making a choice to be at the edges, and that the edges were where the choices were happening, and the choices were being made by people I worked with and ate with, and transmitted alongside for weeks and months before the lockdown alarm had ever tripped. 8 alive. I transmitted it at the hour mark with the same voice I'd used for 14. The light on the equipment panels reached the far wall at hour 30 and started climbing toward the ceiling slots where the daylight came in, through the south-facing louvers. That was a different quality of light, more direct, flattening the shadows on the equipment faces, making the readout panels harder to look at without squinting. Halveth 3's star was low in the sky now in the late afternoon position and coming in, almost horizontal through the louver gaps, long and amber and unhurried. Station 8 contacted us again at hour 33. Extraction vehicle. Route. Estimated arrival. 12 to 17 hours. Window dependent on collective interference density in the corridor. Hold position. Maintain hourly status transmissions on this frequency. The second instruction, maintain hourly status transmissions, was not Station 8 adding protocol for its own benefit. It was Station 8 telling us that someone had heard the transmissions. Someone had been listening and tracking the hour marks and the count, and that the count was doing the thing Orvin had calculated it might do when he tore the first ration sleeve at hour 0. It was getting through. Transmitted back, acknowledge. 8 alive as of hour 33. We are holding. 8 held. Hour 33 through 41. 8 alive. Wrote the same number on 8 consecutive ration sleeves. The block figures got more even, actually. I had been writing numbers under pressure for 33 hours, and there was a steadiness in the hand that comes from repetition, the kind that doesn't reflect confidence or competence, but simply the fact that you've done the motion enough times that the motion no longer requires your full attention, which frees your attention for other things. I spent those hours of 8 thinking about the collective outside the walls. I had access to everything Pell and Ancher had gathered, their field notes, the spectral logs, the annotated examples of Veth-Karath electromagnetic output that they'd been building for 3 weeks before the lockdown. I read through them during the transmission gaps, with a focus I probably hadn't given them under normal working conditions, the way you sometimes understand something better the second time, 'cause the first time you were reading for information and the second time you're reading for architecture. The architecture of what Pell and Ancher had found was this. The Veth-Karath collective had a filing system of extraordinary depth and resolution for everything it classified as a transition, the passage from living to dead, the passage from inaccessible to accessible, the passage from unknown to cataloged. It tracked these transitions across every entity in its operational environment with a precision that the Garrison Xenolinguistics Division had assessed as roughly equivalent to individual identification, not by name or distinguishing feature the way a human records system would identify an individual, but by the specific electromagnetic signature of the transition event, which was apparently as unique to each entity as a fingerprint, which meant the collective had files on the people who had changed the count. Not on the people still alive. On the people who had transitioned. It was logging the losses without knowing, without being structurally capable of knowing, that the count of the losses implied a count of what remained. The two things were the same information, arrived at from different angles, and the collective only had access to one angle because it could only log one direction of the transition. I sat with that for a long time. 41. 8 alive. I transmitted. The room took it. The light was failing now outside. Halveth 3's day was running long in summer, and we had another 2 hours of the amber before dark. But the amber was low, and the shadows inside the transmitter room had shifted from flat to long, and the equipment panels had a different quality in the long shadows, a depth to the readout faces that they hadn't had in the broad midday light. I should say something about the secondary entry point, and what happened there at hour 38, because it is part of the record. and because omitting it would give a false impression of the hours between 33 and 41. The secondary entry point was a reinforced interior door at the northwest corner of the transmitter room. Not an exterior access point, a connecting corridor to the post's environmental control bay, which had its own exterior wall. The environmental control bay was not part of the post's secured architecture in any useful sense. It had been built for equipment access, not personnel protection, and its exterior wall had a maintenance hatch that the post's original installation team had never expected to matter. At hour 38, the collective found the maintenance hatch. I'm not going to describe what the next 40 minutes looked like in detail, because the relevant fact is a number. It held. The secondary entry point held, and the 8 people in the transmitter room remained 8 people in the transmitter room. And at hour 39, I transmitted 8, alive, the same way I'd transmitted every number that preceded it. Even voiced, logged, and time-stamped. But I want to note what Orvin did in those 40 minutes. Because it belongs to the record. He had been maintaining a position at the primary entry point, the main transmitter room door, since the perimeter consolidation at hour 23. When the collective found the maintenance hatch, he moved to the secondary entry point without being asked, without announcement, simply recognizing that the primary entry point had 2 people covering it, and the secondary had 1, and the geometry of the transmitter room made those numbers unequal to what was now required. He took up the position at the secondary door, added himself to the equation, and held. I watched him cross the room in my peripheral vision while I was running the relay cycle, not looking directly, because I was occupied with the transmitter and the relay was giving me a partial carrier tone on the priority 2 node that I needed to track. But I saw it. The movement had the quality of all of his movements in the post. Unhurried, direct, already decided before the body started moving. He came back to the console at hour 39, when the secondary door was quiet again. He stood behind my left shoulder and looked at the 8 on the ration sleeve. He said, "How much sleeve do you have left?" I counted the stack without picking it up visually, running my eyes across the edges. 11 sleeves remaining from the original 40, I told him. He said, "Enough." That was all he said. He went back to his position. Enough. The word held 2 things, at once in a way I didn't unpack until later. Enough to count whatever the count became, and enough that the count would eventually reach 0, if that was where it was going. And the transmitter would send whatever it was given, and the relay would carry it, and the collective would receive it, and hold it in its accumulation of unfiled anomalous data, 40 undifferentiated envelopes and counting. I picked up the relay cycle where I'd left off. Shield carrier tone on the priority 2 node had resolved to static while I wasn't watching it, which meant the window had closed. I logged it and moved to priority 3. Pell noticed me reading through her notes. She watched me for a while from her corner. The same steady watchfulness that I'd become familiar with over those days, the way you become familiar with all the things in a room you're sharing, for an extended period. She wasn't asking anything. She wasn't offering anything. She was simply present. The way the room was present, the way the 11 and the 9 and the 8 had been present. A fact that was what it was. At hour 42 she said, "They can hear it, you know." I said, "I know." She said, "They can't do anything with it." I said, "I know." She said, "It's the only message we have that they can't suppress. Because the only way to suppress it is to understand it. And the only way to understand it is to be able to count what's on the other transition, and they can't." I said, "I know." She said, "Orvin knew that at hour 0. I said, "Yes." She went back to her corner. I went back to the relays. That conversation was the longest either of us had with the other during the entire lockdown. I've thought about it many times, since in the way you think about conversations that were short, but contained the whole architecture of something you'd been living inside without being able to name it. Pell had named it in 4 sentences. The message the collective can't suppress. I was transmitting the only thing in our operational environment that the Vethkarath's filing system categorically could not process. The number of the living, going out every hour to whoever was there. Hour 43, 8 alive. The collective made its move at hour 44. I want to be accurate about what that means, Because move implies an intention that the collective may not have had in the sense we use the word. It didn't decide to breach the perimeter. It didn't change strategy or respond to a trigger. What happened was more like a pressure reaching a threshold. The same way water finds a crack in a wall, not because it decides to find the crack, but because it is present in sufficient volume and the crack is there. The east-facing perimeter gave. I heard it. Not the sound of a structural failure, is what I've been bracing for in the abstract, but a change in the interference pattern on the transmitter channels that meant the collective closer inside the outer line. Orvin's voice, flat and precise, from the east-facing window array. Perimeter east, collapsed. Fall back to transmitter room. Take everything essential. 6 people came through the transmitter room door in the next 4 minutes. Orvin was the last of them. 7 alive. I wrote it on the ration sleeve before I'd done anything else. Before I'd processed the head count, or confirmed who was in the room, or assessed what equipment was still running. The marker was in my hand, and the sleeve was in front of me, and the number was 7. And I wrote it, and I held it up, and the 7 people in the room looked at it. We had a single reinforced interior position now, the transmitter room, with 2 entry points, both of which could be secured for some period whose upper bound I couldn't calculate, but that I was confident was not 0. Primary transmitter array was operational. The secondary relay rack was operational. The external antenna array was still feeding, which meant our signal was still going out. 7 alive. I was going to transmit it at the next hour mark, which was 11 minutes away. I spent those 11 minutes doing what I'd been doing for 44 hours, which was running the relay cycles and logging the responses and maintaining the regular cadence. As if the cadence itself were a form of structural support, which I had come to believe it was. Not metaphorically, literally. The transmitter room was a room. Because the transmitter was operating inside it. Because the relay cycles were running. Because the hourly status ping was going out. Strip those things away, and it was a box on a ridge that the collective was going to walk through, eventually. Keep those things running, and it was a post. We were a post. We were 7 people in a transmitter room, and we were a post. The relay signal from Station 8 was cleaner at hour 45 than it had been at hour 33. I didn't understand the improvement for the first 10 seconds. Interference from a Veth-Kareth containment envelope doesn't ease as the collective gets closer. It should have gotten worse. Then I checked the spectral data and understood. The collective's electromagnetic output in the corridor northeast of Vareth 9 had changed pattern, gone. It was still present and still dense, but the frequency distribution had shifted in a way I recognized from Pell and Anscher's annotated spectral logs. It was the pattern associated with archival retrieval mode. The collective was processing something, not advancing, processing. I didn't have time to analyze it fully because the hour was rolling over and the relay was giving me a clear enough window, and I had a number to transmit. Vareth 9 listening post hour 45, status, 7 alive. Station 8 came back almost immediately. Extraction vehicle, 40 minutes out. What is your perimeter status? Perimeter east collapsed, I transmitted. We are in transmitter room, 7 alive. Transmitter arrays operational, secured position with 2 entry points. What do you need from us? Station 8, maintain transmissions. Extraction vehicle is tracking your signal. Keep talking. Keep talking. That was the instruction, and I followed it in the most literal sense, the same way I'd been following it for 45 hours. Not with explanations or pleas or tactical assessments beyond what was useful to the people trying to reach us, but with the number, clear and even, every 60 minutes. To say something about what the 40 minutes between hour 45 and hour 47 felt like, because the answer is that they felt exactly as long as they were. And I was paying attention to every minute of them. There is a particular quality to waiting, when you know the waiting has a specific terminal point. When the extraction vehicle is 40 minutes out, and not a theoretical future arrival but a tracked inbound, when you can calculate that 2 more hourly transmissions will cover the gap, when the relay signal is clean enough that you're getting fragmented position data on the vehicle's approach corridor. The weight of the waiting is different. It is still weight, but it has a shape now. You can put your hands against its surface and feel the edges of it. Feel where it ends. I could feel where it ended. I was counting toward it. The 7 of us occupied the transmitter room in the positions we'd held for the last several hours. Orvin near the primary entry point, 2 of the liaison staff covering the secondary, Ansher at the relay rack corridor, with the specific stillness that had become his signature over the whole lockdown, Pell beside me at the console. The xenolinguistics researcher whose name I won't put in this account because she hasn't given me permission to do so, was in the corner, nearest the relay rack with her field notes open on her lap, still writing, which I found remarkable, and still find remarkable. I've never asked her what she was writing in those last 40 minutes. I think of it sometimes. The act of documenting under those conditions, in those final minutes. While the extraction vehicle was tracking our signal in from the northeast corridor and the collective outside was processing its accumulating stack of identical envelopes. Writing it down because it needed to be written down, the same logic, I suppose, that drove the relay logs and the timestamp notations and the ration sleeve stack. Some things need to be recorded as they happen. Orvin was quiet for the full 40 minutes. Not the silence of someone managing fear. The silence of someone who had done everything he knew to do and had verified that it was done and was now waiting for the result with the same composure he'd brought to the doing of it. I'd spent 47 hours watching that composure operate, and I still couldn't fully articulate what distinguished it from suppression. It wasn't the suppression of feeling. It was something more like the correct placement of feeling. Acknowledgement without submission, the way you note the weight of a thing you're carrying, without adjusting your stride. He'd been carrying the weight of the count since hour 0. He'd started it, knowing what the count would do and knowing what the count might become, and he'd handed the marker to me and gone to his position at the east-facing window array and held that position. In the 47 hours since then, the count had moved from 14 to 7, and the marker had passed through my hands 22 times on 2 different ration sleeves. And the thing he'd started was still going. I thought about that in the last 40 minutes. I had time to think about it, which I hadn't always had in the preceding 46 hours. The collective's archival retrieval pattern held through the 40 minutes. Pell had come to sit beside me again, not speaking, watching the spectral display on the secondary monitor the same way I was watching it. At some point she said quietly, "It's trying to file the count," I said. "The count of the living," she said. "It intercepted every transmission we made. 45 of them. 45 instances of a count of the living. The collective is pattern matching. It found 45 instances of the same data structure, and it's trying to create a file category for the data structure," I said. "Can it?" she said. "No. Not without a concept of counting the living. It can recognize that the same structure appeared 45 times. It cannot understand what the structure contains. It's doing the equivalent of finding 45 identical envelopes in its record system and trying to understand them without being able to open them," I said. "And while it's doing that," she said, "it's in archival retrieval, not appetitive advance. It's thinking rather than moving, for however long thinking takes," I said. "I've been going to need it to keep thinking for about 30 more minutes." Pell didn't say anything. She watched the spectral display, hour 46. I transmitted. 7 alive still. The relay carried it clean and the vehicle's approach signal was stronger now. Ansher was watching the door. 2 of the military liaison staff had taken positions at the secondary entry point. Orvin was beside me at the console. Not for any tactical reason. His position was elsewhere. But because the console was where the transmitter was, and he'd come to stand beside the thing he'd started. He looked the ration on sleeve in front of me. The 7, written in the same block figures as the 14 from hour 0, on the 22nd ration sleeve, from a stack that I'd been burning through one at a time for 46 hours. He didn't say anything, stood beside me while the relay cycled, and the vehicle signal grew, and the collective continued its archival retrieval pattern, 45 identical envelopes in its records, that it was turning over and over and over, trying to find the file category for the data that human beings had been transmitting into empty air since the first hour of the first day. I was counting the minutes to the next hour mark without thinking about it, the way Ansher had counted them. 30 minutes, 20, 10. The vehicle signal resolving into a solid track, now on the approach corridor. Northeast, clean channel. Station 8 relay booster, active and boosting. The extraction vehicle transmitting its own status pings, and our system receiving them and logging them 5 minutes to the hour mark. The collective spectral pattern had not changed. Still archival retrieval, still thinking. 3 minutes. Tore the last usable ration sleeve from the stack. There were 2 left. One was damp from a condenser line above the relay rack that had been running a slow drip since hour 12, and the marker wouldn't hold on a wet surface. I wrote the 7 on the dry one, checked it. Block figures, 2 centimeters. Exactly as Orvin had written the first one. 1 minute. Outside. Not loud but present and approaching, cutting through the interference in a way that wasn't electromagnetic. The sound of a vehicle on final approach. The extraction vehicle. 43 minutes from when Station 8 had given us the window. Inside the estimate, the hour rolled over. Verith 9 listening post. 47. Status 7 alive. I logged the transmission. I put the marker down on the console beside the ration sleeve. I didn't pick it up again. The vehicle set down in the hardpoint's exterior pad. The sound of it landing was the most specific and grounded and real. Sound I had heard in 47 hours. The mechanical thud of landing struts, finding a solid surface. The turbine pitch cycling down. Not an abstraction. Not a carrier tone through a degraded relay channel. The actual weight of an actual machine sitting down on the actual ridge. 7 people went out through the secured entry point and into the afternoon light. I was the last one out, which wasn't a decision I made consciously. It was simply how it happened, the same way the marker had become mine, and the ration sleeves had become mine, and the hourly transmission had become mine. You don't always choose the things that belong to you. Sometimes you pick them up without deciding to, and carry them to the end. The last ration sleeve with me. Not as a keepsake, not as a trophy. I'm not a person who keeps things. I took it because it was the last in a sequence. And sequences have a last item. And the last item is the one that closes the sequence. And as long as the sequence was open, I was still transmitting. The vehicle lifted off 12 minutes after landing. 7 people aboard. The collective's electromagnetic suppression was still present in the corridor below us, but growing smaller as we gained altitude. And the archival retrieval pattern was still in the spectral data on the vehicle's monitors. I could see it on the display from where I was sitting. 46 identical envelopes now. 47 by the time we cleared the ridge. 48 by the time the vehicle was in clean air above the interference layer. And Station 8 was coming in on a full-strength relay. We reached the garrison 6 hours later. The medical staff met us at the landing pad. Orvin and I walked off the vehicle last, the same way I'd walked out of the transmitter room last. Not a decision, just the natural ordering of things. He was carrying nothing except what he'd had on him when the lockdown alarm had tripped. I was carrying the ration sleeve. He looked at it when we were on the pad, under the garrison lights. The first real overhead lighting I'd been in for more than 2 days. At the 7 in block marker on the white panel. He said, "You kept every one of them," I said. "The sleeves?" "No, I left most of them behind," he said. No, he didn't say anything else. He walked toward the medical bay entrance, and I went with him, the ration sleeve in my hand. And, behind us, the extraction vehicle's crew were running their post-flight checks in the amber light of the landing pad. And somewhere in the ridge corridor that we'd left, the Veth Karoth collective was still turning its 48 envelopes over in its archival retrieval process, trying to build a file category for a data structure it had never encountered before. The count of the living, offered freely, every hour, to anyone who might be listening. The Garrison Xenolinguistics Division ran a full analysis of the collective spectral data from the lockdown period. The recordings I'd made from the monitoring channels, the transmission logs, the spectral profiles of the archival retrieval ball pattern that had started at hour 45 and continued, as far as their instruments could track it, at least 12 hours after our extraction. The lead analyst sent me a summary 3 weeks later, Shames at the debrief room where Ansher had told me about counting the minutes to the hour marks. The summary was 8 pages. The conclusion was on the last page, 2 paragraphs. I read the first paragraph twice and the second paragraph once. The first paragraph said, The Beth-Karath Collective processed 48 instances of the Vareth-9 status transmission. Analysis of the electromagnetic output during the archival retrieval window indicates the collective successfully identified the recurring structural element, the count, and matched it across all 48 instances. It logged 48 confirmed receptions of the structure. It could not assign the structure to any existing file category. It could not create a new file category without a conceptual anchor, and the conceptual anchor required a stable reference class for living entities, as distinct from transitioning entities, does not exist in the collective's architecture. The 48 instances were logged as anomalous undifferentiated data and remain unfiled. The second paragraph said, the most significant operational finding is the duration and depth of the archival retrieval engagement. The collective devoted a substantial portion of its local processing capacity to the anomaly for an extended period. This is consistent with the collective's documented response to genuinely unclassifiable data. Not dismissal, but extended iterative analysis. The Vareth-9 status transmissions produced a processing demand that was, by our assessment, equivalent to a significant tactical disruption. Not because the data was threatening, because it was structurally incomprehensible. I folded the summary and put it in my field jacket pocket, beside the ration sleeve. The analyst was waiting for a response. I thought about what to say. I thought about Orvin at hour 0, tearing the first sleeve and writing the first number, already having done the calculation that I was still catching up to. I thought about Pell saying the only way to suppress the message is to understand it, and they can't. I thought about 47 transmissions, clear, and even going out through a Beth-Karath containment envelope that couldn't touch them because it couldn't categorize them. Thought about the one data structure in our entire operational environment that an intelligence built around cataloging transitions could not file. The fact of the living, announced rather than hidden, offered openly to empty air and enemy-monitored frequencies alike, because offering it cost nothing, and hiding it bought nothing, because we were not trying to avoid being found. We were trying to be found by the right people, because the right people were listening, and the wrong people were listening, and only one of those could do anything useful with what they heard. I said to the analyst, "What do they do with unfiled data?" The analyst said, "They hold it indefinitely. They don't discard data. They accumulate it against the possibility that a future encounter will provide the conceptual anchor they're missing." I said, "So they still have it?" The analyst said, "Yes. All 48 instances." I said, 47. The last one went out on the vehicle above the interference layer. They wouldn't have received it cleanly. The analyst checked the logs. Said, 47 confirmed. Correct. I sat with that for a moment. 47 transmissions over 40 hours, every one of them received, every one of them logged, in the collective's records as an anomalous undifferentiated data instance. Because the data structure had no file category, and the collective had no mechanism to create one. Every one of them accumulating in a holdings queue that the collective would hold indefinitely by its own documented practice, against the theoretical possibility that a future encounter would provide the missing conceptual anchor. The anchor it would need was a concept the collective did not possess, and, as far as the Garrison Xenolinguistics Division had been able to determine in 3 years of study, had no architectural pathway to develop. The living, specifically persistently hourly, the living, not the lost, not the transitions, not the before and after. The number of the people who were still there. I still have the last ration sleeve. The 7 is still legible. The marker held on that surface better than I'd expected, considering the conditions. Block figures, 2 centimeters tall. Exactly as Worvin had written the first one, though I'd never seen his first one again after I'd crossed it out and replaced it, at hour 6, and I hadn't been trying to match his hand. I wasn't copying him. I was continuing what he'd started. That's the only way I know to describe it. And I've thought about the description carefully, because it matters to get right. He started it. I continued it. 47 transmissions start to finish. In 2 different hands on 22 different ration sleeves. They transmitted was always the same. The specific number of specific people who were still alive, given without qualification, without tactical concealment, without the hedging that doctrine would have suggested, because the doctrine was written for adversaries who understood what the number meant. The Veth Karath didn't understand what the number meant. That was the only advantage we had, and we used it for 47 hours. 7 walked out,